Cool. Can everyone hear me through the mic? Okay, awesome. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you're all fed and refreshed from lunch. As has been mentioned, and as evident from the slide, my name's Devin. This was quite a unique name up until a robot stole it a few weeks ago. Nevertheless, I won't be changing it. I live in New Zealand, in a town called Christchurch, which is in the South Island. It's the largest city in the South Island, although I think by Chinese standards it's probably a rural village. I've been an iOS developer for 7 years now. I got a job straight out of university at a company called Smudge, which is an agency in New Zealand, and basically learned everything that I know about iOS development through this job. Prior to that, I'd only really done web development, and so this was a great opportunity just to learn as I was working. Smudge is an agency, so we build apps for a range of customers, but the main one is the police in New Zealand, and we build a suite of apps that they use that helps them to do their paperwork and reporting and keeps them safe when they're out on the road as well. I pretty quickly grew to love iOS development through this job. I've always been very passionate about Apple products, and so this became a really natural fit, being able to build things for the platforms. A couple of years into working, I started spending my spare time working on some projects, and one of those things eventually became an app called Crouton. Cooking is something I've also always been interested in. I've been cooking since I was very young, and when I moved out and got married, I started doing the meal planning and the cooking, just as a way to keep costs down. Initially, I was just using the Notes app on iPhone to keep track of this. Notes is a pretty good way to start most apps, and so I just had the days of the week at the top and then a huge list down the bottom that just got longer and longer as I added recipes. This worked pretty well for probably a couple of years, but hit some scaling issues after that, and so I thought with my newfound app making abilities, I could probably make something that simplified this a little bit, and so Crouton was born. Crouton launched in 2019 on iOS and iPadOS, and since then I've been working on it in my evenings ever since. In 2022, I shipped the macOS version using Catalyst, and then last year I made a companion app for watchOS that lets you see the recipe steps and ingredients on your wrist as you move about the kitchen. Just helps you keep context when you're away from a device. And so I was super excited then when Apple announced the Vision Pro at WWDC last year, and knew that I had to get Crouton working on it as soon as possible. I'm sure some of you recall that the SDK for visionOS didn't actually drop for about 2 weeks after the event, so it wasn't possible to get started straight away, even though I was very excited to do so. And so I just started off in that gap by mocking up how I thought Crouton could look based on the design guidelines we've been given. And I will say, I think the design tools that we've had for the 2D interfaces like Sketch and things, there's definitely they're going to have to get up to speed with some of the new paradigms for blurring and the perspective shifting and things. But I certainly found my MacBook got pretty warm in those first few weeks trying to do some of these elements. When the SDK finally dropped, I took the day off from my day job so that I could get right in with Crouton. And it felt a little bit like a mad race, trying to see how quickly I could get Crouton to compile. Because it was an existing app on iOS, there was no shortage of build errors. And so the focus of this session that we have together now is to look at how we can take our iOS apps and update them, not just to run on visionOS, but to be a good platform citizen. And we're going to do this through the lens of how I took Crouton from not compiling at all to being on the App Store day one. So, step number 1, get the app to compile. As I mentioned, at this point, Crouton was about 4 years old, and I started working on it just before the launch of SwiftUI, so most of the code base is UIKit, which we'll come back to later on. This meant that there are a lot of APIs that I use that just aren't available on visionOS yet. Things like live activities, widgets, haptics, camera, third-party libraries. And actually, just a quick aside on third-party libraries. I think it's really good to be mindful about which third-party libraries you do add to your apps. In the moment when you're trying to solve a particular problem, it can sometimes be compelling just to throw in a library that might solve the problem for you. But there's certainly cases where this can come back to be an issue, especially when a new platform like visionOS comes out and you want to jump in on it straight away. It can often be some time before these other developers update their apps, their libraries to work on visionOS, and perhaps maybe not at all in some cases, which I think means if you want to be nimble, it's important just to minimize the use of third-party libraries, or at least be considerate about which libraries you do add. And that way you're not held back if key parts of your app become reliant on these third parties. Thankfully for Crouton, the key ones that I use were updated within those first few months. So by the time I got to launch, I was able to use those features, but there's certainly a period of time where you have to comment out bits of code in order to keep things running until those libraries update. And so I think if we want to play the long game with our apps, it's really important to try and build out as much as we can, or lean on platform APIs that will hopefully get updated as the system evolves. Anyway, as I was saying, there's a decent amount of baggage that Crouton had to bring across into the new spatial environment. And so I spent quite a few hours spraying this around the code base just to flag off areas which didn't work. And after doing this quite a few times, running, rerunning, putting it in a few more places, running again and again, eventually I got the ever-exciting build succeeded, and Crouton sprang into life in the simulator. I say sprang into life. There's certainly a lot of work to be done. Before we dive into the details, I want to talk a little bit about platform consistency. As for me, this is one of the most important parts of building software and building useful software, not just for visionOS, but for any platform. One of the biggest ways that you can save yourself and users angst is to pay attention to the platform and to lean into it. Users coming to your apps have already built up, whether consciously or not, a strong understanding or familiarity with the platform. It's especially the case with phones now, which we've had for maybe around 16 years, and the UI and navigation remains largely unchanged. When we build software that follows platform conventions, it means that when users download our apps, they already know how to use them, and the quicker then they'll hopefully see value and want to keep using them. So what is platform consistency? Well, for me, I think it comes down to these things: general navigation, content size, system gestures, and element style. So general navigation, this is things like using tab bars, split views, navigation controllers correctly. I'm sure we can all think of some examples where apps misuse these, and it can create quite a jarring experience when you expect one thing, but the app sends you off in a different direction. Content size is another very important one. If content is too large or too small in its default state, it can stick out like a sore thumb from the rest of the platform. Of course, things like accessibility settings will modify this, so it's also important to make sure that our apps update with these changes as well. For system gestures, this is things like long presses for extra actions, swiping to go back, tapping the tab bar to pop the view controller. These are all the gestures that users will come to expect, and so when your app doesn't do them, it can be quite disruptive to what might be quite a subconscious flow through your app. And lastly, element style. This is things like button shapes, corner radius, shadows, etc. And this might be one where it can be good to branch out from the system in some ways, just to have a bit of character and personality to our apps. But similar to the other key points, the more that we empower users to understand and use our creations, the more we do this, the more we empower users just to understand and use our creations without having to teach them first. So with this in mind then, let's look at Crouton on visionOS and identify some areas of platform consistency that need improving. The first one that stood out to me, that Hida covered as well, is visual style, and the visual style of a lot of the elements. visionOS leans very heavily on the glass UI, or the blurred effect, whereas Crouton on iOS uses a lot of solid colors, and so large amounts of the interface would just obscure the background. And it says in the human interface guidelines to avoid using opaque colors in a window. Areas of opacity can block people's view and make them feel constricted and reducing their awareness of the virtual and physical objects around them. It's worth noting that there are a few exceptions to this. Apple's Notes app, for example, uses a solid white background for the note. So there are some cases, I think, where you do want to pull the user in to focus on the content, but it's worth doing that on a case-by-case basis rather than sort of consistently through the UI. So after a few hours of painstakingly working through all of the UI and switching over to using UI visual effect views so that the translucency would pull through, Crouton started to look a bit more like this. Hopefully looking a lot better already. The tab bar icons are there, making good progress. The next one is content size. We'll already be familiar from earlier today, but on iOS, the smallest size for a tap target should be 44 points. Back when they were building the original iPhone, they did a series of tests and found that this is the smallest size to comfortably tap something with your finger. And so with Vision Pro, when we moved to a Vision gaze-based interface, it's very similar, but we moved to 60 points as your eyes are less accurate than a finger tap. And for me, I think this is one of the key points or key things to do to actually make your Vision OS app feel at home, is making sure that your elements are sized correctly and also spaced apart from each other so that each one can be individually isolated. I've certainly noticed in my use, especially on web browsing, you can get into some situations where the buttons are too close together and you just physically can't select one of the buttons. And this creates a very frustrating experience for the user. And so something that's just really good to do is go through your app and test every single button and make sure you can interact with it. Otherwise, you and the users won't be able to. Along with eye tracking comes hover states. To me, hover states are a little bit like colored tints on iOS. iOS uses color to denote interactability, so anything that's colored is usually able to be tapped. Similarly, on Vision OS, anything that's able to be interacted with has a hover state. By default, most UI elements get this hover effect, but there are some instances where, and especially in UIKit, where it just defaults either to nothing at all or to the wrong shape. So this button, for example, should really be a circle, but it defaults to the square, which is incorrect. So it's important to go through as well and look at all of the buttons. And transitions use the proper shape, which is a simple one-line thing, just setting the shape to circle. But this makes a big difference just to softening the UI and blending it in with the rest of the elements. Similarly, you can have the opposite effect, where some elements that are not interactable appear as interactable. This is very common if you have list views or UI table views. It'll make the cells interactable by default, which means as a user, when you look at them, it can appear that there's an action. And so you essentially have to go through and do the opposite. And in all of these places, you want to set the hover style to be none, so that if you've got actions on the button, on the cell, then those can be interacted with instead. So, with all of these changes applied, I started to feel like Crouton was really beginning to belong on Vision OS, and it was exciting that with these small tweaks, I had running essentially the same app that I have on iOS and macOS on a brand new platform. Another key piece to build on this further was the general navigation and layout. On iOS, Crouton uses a tab bar layout at the bottom, which when displayed on iPadOS changes to be a split view. And most of this behavior translates for free on Vision OS, but the layout isn't quite right. And especially with the folder and recipe list and the large fonts, it became a pretty cramped UI. So to find a solution for this, I decided to look at Apple's apps on the platform to see if I could find a similar approach to navigation on iPadOS, and I could see how they translated it across to Vision OS. So my first thought was the Files app. They have a tab bar on iOS. However, on Vision OS, they omit the tab bar completely and just have a single split view. The Notes app uses a triple column view and an ornament at the bottom, so it's still not quite right either. But I ended up finding with Photos that this is the perfect example. It keeps the tab bar on the left, but then it has nested split views within that and even some single views, which is essentially identical to Crouton. And so this is a good example and exactly what I needed to pull across. And I find this is generally a good approach to solving your UI problems. If you aren't sure about it, as we talked about earlier, anywhere that we can lean into the platform, we win with the users who will then already hopefully know how to move through our apps. So with all those changes in place, I felt like Crouton was finally a visionOS app. It has all the same functionality as iOS and the macOS apps, and it feels at home on visionOS. Now, it could be easy to call it job done and ship it to the store, but this is really only just the start. visionOS is a whole new paradigm of computing, and while I think there's value in having our existing apps just run on visionOS so that the user can access them if they've already got it on for other things, there's a huge opportunity here to think about ways that we can make our apps the reason someone might put it on in the first place. So for me, I got thinking about the cooking experience. Now, I should say from the outset, most of the work that I did on this was before I had a chance to try the device myself, and it was just using the simulator. So I had to make some assumptions about what it would be like to wear. Now that I have the device, I'm not so sure that I would recommend you actually use it to cook, especially around hot equipment and sharp utensils. But I do think the operating system itself is rock solid, and very likely the operating system will have long into the future as the hardware adjusts around it. And so to me, it's very exciting that we can start building these experiences now that will run just as well, if not even better, as the hardware catches up. So this basically gives me a head start. And also, I know that there'll be like some crazy people that are happy just to give it a go now and get cooking their lasagna. So it's nice to have it there for them. With that being said, the first area that I got started on was timers, as this seemed to be the lowest hanging fruit. One feature that's core to visionOS is the window placement and stability. When you place a window, it stays exactly where you left it, and they're very easy to move around and reposition. And this was something that I could use to my advantage for timers, as the placement gesture essentially comes for free. On iOS, on the iOS version of Crouton, I support various quick tap features in the step-by-step mode of recipes that let you access helpful information. So for temperatures, timers, and ingredients, they're all automatically detected, and you can tap on them. So tapping on the temperature gives you the conversion from Celsius to Fahrenheit, or the other way if you really need to. And you can also see the quantity for ingredients and start timers directly. And so this felt like an ideal feature to translate across to visionOS, as it becomes a step even more convenient when you just have to look at the various actions. On iOS, these timers float around in a little window, so you can sort of flick them around. But on visionOS, I wanted them to have their own windows. And this is really trivial if you're using a SwiftUI app. You just declare the open window environment variable and then call open window. However, for me, as I mentioned earlier, I'm primarily using a UIKit application with a scene delegate, and so this convenient function is not as readily available, but it's as easy enough as just posting a notification from the button tap and then picking that up in the app class and then calling this open window from there. And so from there, it pretty much all just works with the existing code. And so that looks a little bit like this. You can tap on the time, start timer, and then drag it into place as needed, and you can have as many as you want. I have tested this, and I haven't hit an upper limit, so you could have as many times as you want, seemingly. Temperature conversion was almost no work. I just added a little bit of 3D padding so that the popover popped out, and also made it a glass effect just so that it blends in. But also, as Hida mentioned, it's worth limiting the use of the 3D padding just to reduce fatigue for the user, and so using it sparingly, I think, is a good way just to add a bit of delight to the interface rather than overwhelming. So far, we've really only talked about UIKit and SwiftUI for visionOS, which are the frameworks for building 2D interfaces. The other key part of visionOS is RealityKit, which lets us build out 3D views for our apps. And one of the core tenets of RealityKit is that content's rendered in real size to the physical world. So if you have a meter square cubed in RealityKit, you'll have a meter square cube in real life. Which got me thinking, maybe there's a few ways this could be useful in the cooking context. Thinking about things like maybe how you can measure spaghetti by the diameter. So maybe we project a circle down onto the bench and you can get your serving size, or maybe we overlay on the tray where to place the cookies. What I eventually landed on, just as a first version of making use of this, was what I call the size guide. Often in recipes, it will suggest which size dish to use. It might say, get a 12 by 12 inch tray with baking paper. Now for me, I have a pretty hard time reading that and understanding what that looks like or which of my dishes match the size. And so this seemed like a good opportunity to use RealityKit. So the first step was just writing a regex to pick up the common phrasing for this in the recipe. This is probably the hardest piece of the whole process. And then I can detect that and then let the user tap on it. Now, moving through the next step would have been really simple if Crouton was a SwiftUI app, because I could just launch a volumetric window just by calling open window. But this is currently limited or completely restricted from UIKit, which means if you have a scene delegate, there's no way to present volumetric windows from UIKit. So it meant that I had to take a brief aside and perform some open heart surgery on Crouton to rip out the scene delegate and plug in the SwiftUI app lifecycle instead. Now, most of this was pretty straightforward, just very time-consuming, making sure all the hooks into the app still worked as they did previously. But one oversight that I'll point out in case it saves anyone else an elevated heart rate like mine. Unfortunately, I didn't realize that there's one hook that still needs to be in the scene delegate that you can't remove, and that's for accepting CloudKit share requests. So if someone sends you an iCloud invite, when you accept that, it has to route through the scene delegate. And if you remove this function, then nothing happens, and you get a lot of emails from users wondering why nothing happens, which is fair enough. Thankfully, I realized what had gone wrong and added this back in and shipped an update. And I thought everything was fine. Then I got another email from a different user, and this was when my heart rate really went up. And I was worried I'd be in the next Dear Tim Apple Watch commercial. And they were launching the app, and it was just opening to a black screen. And it turns out there's a system bug where if you switch between using a scene delegate and not, apps that were on the old version, when they update, will just launch to a blank screen and never change. Thankfully, this ends up being a very simple fix, which I'm going to share with you to save you all some time. You just need to make sure that you include the window variable in the scene delegate, and then everything is fine, and you can go to sleep. So with all of that in place, and Crouton successfully migrated over to using SwiftUI, then I was able to go back to the size guide that we were discussing, and that ends up looking a little bit like this. So I can tap on the measurement, bring up the size, and then place it on the bench, and hopefully find a tray that matches. Now, as I mentioned before, a lot of this functionality that I've added to Crouton was really focused around the cooking experience and is really future-proofing the app. But it's also important to look at ways that Crouton could make use of the spatial environment now and ways that would be useful to users now. And one of the key parts of Crouton, one of the reasons I started it, is the meal planning feature. And for me, this is usually done at the start of the week, sitting on the couch. So an ideal setting for Vision Pro. So I got to thinking, how could this be enhanced by Vision OS? Now, if you've had a chance to use Vision Pro, you'll no doubt know just how stunning the displays are. And one thing I noticed is how good the recipe photos can look when viewing them on Vision OS. And so I thought perhaps I could lean into this in some way in the meal planning, and hopefully that would be a good experience. And so this thinking eventually landed on something which I've coined the shuffle deck. One challenge when meal planning can often be that you get stuck cooking the same recipes and you just scroll past ones that you may not notice ordinarily. And so the shuffle deck aims to kind of fix this problem by presenting to you front and center recipes which you might ordinarily miss. So you simply swipe through the recipes left and right, and then if you find one you like, you can just drag it over and drop it on the day of the week that you want to cook it. And it's very hard to see on this slide, but there's depth to these cards. So as you move through, they push towards you and it creates quite a nice experience. A few interesting discoveries that I made while building this feature that I think are worth sharing. Originally, when you dragged the cards, they would move the same distance as your drag, which meant if you moved 20 points across, the card would move 20 points, much like this, which in the simulator felt totally fine, and you wouldn't think that there was a problem. But trying it on device, you find that it gets fatiguing very quickly, having to drag the full distance across. And so my solution to this was just to multiply the distance that the hand moves and apply that to the card, so it instead moves much greater. And this ends up being quite a good, simple solution. But I think this highlights one important thing about developing for visionOS. Testing on the physical device is really important. You pick up things that you just totally miss, and especially even on phones, I find running on the simulator versus the phone, you pick up so many things when you try it on a real device. And I think it's especially the case when you move into a 3D environment. And obviously these devices aren't very accessible at the moment, but I would strongly encourage, if you want to build for visionOS, it's really good just to try and get even 10 minutes of use if you can find it, because it'll make a big difference to the decisions that you make. So with the Shuffle deck ready to go, I felt like Crouton was ready for launch day. There's still, and still is, plenty of room for improvement, but with these changes and tweaks, it felt like a good 1.0. Now, it's all well and good doing all of this work for a launch release, but an important step not to overlook is letting other people know about what you've done. For me, when I have a new release coming out, I usually email a few people from the press, either that I think will be interested or that I have a relationship with. In my experience, I often don't hear back on these, but it's good just to do it so I can tick the box and carry on. However, this time I decided to reach out to Joanna Stern from the Wall Street Journal, just on a whim. She often does quite quirky reviews, and so I thought it could be a really good fit for Crouton. To my surprise, she actually responded to my email, said that the app looked cool, and asked if I had any recipe suggestions. I was pretty shocked and surprised to even get a response, but I still didn't get my hopes up that this would mean anything for launch day. However, when the embargo dropped, I got a message very early in the New Zealand morning from a friend in Canada with a link to the video from the Wall Street Journal. And it was pretty crazy to see Crouton get a prominent feature in this review. There's a decent segment of it, and even one of the main things that Joanna calls out as being enjoyable on the device. And it's especially a bizarre experience seeing your app being used for the first time in the Wall Street Journal. This is before I'd even really used it. So it was quite daunting going into the video, seeing what she was going to say. But this video ended up sort of catapulting Crouton sort of into the mainstream for a few days and really set it up for an amazing launch. And it's obviously been a heck of a lot better than I anticipated, which was very cool. And I think it's a good example of where hard work and luck intersect. I was fortunate enough to get my hands on one early in New Zealand, a few days after the US launch. This is me explaining to my wife why I've got a $7,000 box. But it's been really great having more hands-on time with the device and been able to try out a few more crazy ideas that you just can't do in the simulator. So I thought before we conclude, we'd just run through a few of those. The first one is a feature for Crouton that I've actually been building for mobile already. We'll hopefully release in the next few weeks. And that's a guided weighing mode where you compare to a nearby Bluetooth scale and then get results in Crouton. And so I thought it'd be fun to try this on visionOS. And so you can place the measurement above the bowl and saves you sort of peeking under the bowl and looking back and forwards between the ingredients. It can just guide you through and help you when to move on. And this is another example of something which may not be useful now, but hopefully in a few years should be quite fun. Another one I've been investigating, which you already showed earlier, is something that I've wanted since the Vision Pro was announced. I'm not sure why the idea popped into my head, but I just really wanted an app where I could have a stack of plates and smash them. I was really hoping that someone else would do it and release an app, but come launch day, there was no site on the store of a plate smashing app, so I had to make it. But the logic was also it's also a really good opportunity, I think, to branch out into some of the parts of visionOS that I'm not used to. Most of my experience is in flat 2D interfaces, and so this seemed like a great opportunity to learn more about hand tracking and all of the spatial things for quite a simple app. And so essentially all you need to do is get the hand tracking that you already showed, and then basically all I do is track the distance between the thumb and the index, and when they get close enough, spawn a plate, and then when they get far enough apart again, then release the plate. And we saw the video before, it essentially looks like this. So you can throw the plates and then they collide and smash. You can throw as many as you want, 7, 11, as many as you want. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. I remember when I first got it working, I let out a bit of a laugh, and I think my wife wondered what I was up to. Yeah, but anyway, one thing's for sure, this is a super fun device to develop for. I will also just put these up. These are really great example projects from Apple for using hand tracking and spatial construction. And these are what I used as a starting point for the plate smashing app. So if you're interested in doing something similar, I'd really recommend checking out these two. So just quickly to recap then, some of the main points that we've covered from bringing your apps from iOS to visionOS. We looked broadly at platform consistency and how when we make the most of platform paradigms to engage our users and encourage them to use all of the things that we've worked hard on. We discussed how we should find some of the key features from our apps and think about how we can enhance them for visionOS to make use of the spatial environment. And we also covered how while the hardware itself might not lend itself to certain experiences now, it shouldn't prevent us from experimenting. As developers, we get to help decide what this platform will become. And so by trying things now and getting feedback from users, we have the chance to shape spatial computing. And most importantly, have fun. This is the most futuristic device, and it sometimes feels a bit crazy that I get to just have one in my house. There's so much room for exploration, and we've barely even scratched the surface of what can be done. So thank you for your attention and for having me today.
Does anyone want to like a one-to-one question and Q&A? If you want to 有任何问题都可以直接问，或者you wanna Okay, it seems like okay. 首先就是抱歉一个事儿啊，就是听说这个同传的效果不是特别的好，就是可能这个讲稿的自动的翻译有一些问题，这个确实非常抱歉。然后呢，这是关于这个我们其实大家也想了一些方案去给大家一个更好的体验。您说。Steven? There's a question, but let me wait me 1 minute. 就是首先非常抱歉。那么我们的解决办法是这样，就首先并不是所有的嘉宾这个讲的内容其实跟他的讲稿一定一样。然后呢，不一定他每个嘉宾都有那么详细的讲稿。但是我们给大家补救的办法是这样，就是在每一个嘉宾讲完之后，我们会想办法，如果有可能的话，给一个中文的版本先。然后呢，因为我们大会全程都有视频录制，但是这个视频可能会后也会处理。然后呢，我们会根据视频的实际情况，给大家一个中文版本的完整的讲稿给到大家。这个确实因为是一个社区组织的活动，那个同传的效果啊，什么可能一系列的地方不一定考虑的非常周全。当然有任何问题也这个大家一起指出。然后呢，这个我们也尽量这个保证每一位这个参与者的体验，好吧？确实非常抱歉。Anything to add on this? Okay, so like I continue the question. Somebody want to ask you, how did you manage to build the function that calculate the weight when you're like pouring the powder? How did you actually divide that?
So it's hard to tell from the video, so it almost looks a little deceiving. Not intending to be. There's a Bluetooth scale that sits under the bowl, and so the scale's reporting the values to the device, and then I'm just taking that and hopefully building a nice experience around it and linking it with the ingredients. But it's not pulling any information from Vision Pro to do the calculations. It's just from the scale that sits underneath.
所以其实是不是用那个 Vision Pro 的采集的信息直接去so is it hard coded or is it like any how does the information actually come from your code or?
The information is coming from the Bluetooth scale, so the values you see there are correct to the flour being weighed. Yep.
对，它应该是就是菜单里面原有的那个信息啊。Any more question? Okay, let's move on to. I think let's just move on to our next speaker, and you guys can continue talking. Thank you very much.